For years, everyone thought they knew exactly what was wrong with this man. They thought they had him figured out. They were wrong about almost all of it. Look at his hand. That single gesture, fingers rubbing together after a touchdown, will follow him for 14 years. Right now, in this photo, it means arrogance. It means a kid who thinks the rules do not apply to him. By the end of this story, the same gesture will mean something else entirely. It will mean a man who almost did not live long enough to make it again. Here is the part that took years to become public knowledge, the part that flips the whole story on its head. The illness that explains almost everything about his collapse was not diagnosed until after his football career was already dead. Not before the chaos. After it. For years, the world watched a young quarterback behave in ways that looked reckless, entitled, self-destructive, and it built him a character out of those behaviors. Nobody knew they were watching something with a clinical name. He did not know it either. To understand how a kid this talented ended up in a place this dark, we have to go back to Texas, to a town most NFL fans have never heard of. Tyler, Texas, is an oil and roses town in the eastern part of the state, and it is where Johnny Manziel was born. He grew up in Kerrville, in the Texas Hill Country, the kind of place where high school football is closer to religion than entertainment, where entire towns close their businesses early on a Friday night just to fill a stadium that seats more people than the town technically has. It is the same football-soaked culture that has produced dozens of college stars over the decades, a pipeline so reliable that Texas high school coaches sometimes get more local recognition than the mayor. And from an early age, Manziel was simply different from the other quarterbacks around him. He was not just accurate, he was electric, a player who could break a play that looked dead and turn it into 40 yards with his legs, then throw a strike across his body while falling down. College recruiters from across the country wanted him. He verbally committed to Oregon as a teenager, then changed his mind and signed with Texas A&M instead, a program that was about to make the biggest jump in its history, moving into the brutal Southeastern Conference. Nobody in college football was ready for what happened next. In 2012, as a true freshman who had redshirted the year before, Johnny Manziel did something no player in the history of the award had ever done. He won the Heisman Trophy, not as a junior, not as a senior. As a first-year player, the youngest winner in the history of the sport's most storied individual honor, he put up video game numbers. Over 4,600 yards of total offense in the SEC alone, the toughest conference in the country. He beat top-ranked Alabama on the road, in Tuscaloosa, in one of the signature wins of that entire college football season, a program that had won the national championship the year before and would win it again the year after, making the upset look less like a fluke and more like a statement. Grown men who had covered the sport for decades said they had never seen anything quite like him. Analysts compared his improvisational style to a playground game that had wandered onto a Southeastern Conference field by mistake and somehow kept winning anyway. And with the trophy came a name that would outlive the player himself, Johnny Football. It started as an affectionate nickname, a tribute to a talent that seemed to make the sport look easy. But something happened to that nickname almost immediately, something that would define everything that followed. It stopped being a description of what he did on Saturdays. It became a persona, a character, a brand that lived a life separate from the 20-year-old kid wearing it. Johnny Football went to nightclubs. Johnny Football signed autographs by the thousands. Johnny Football partied like the most famous college athlete in America, because that is what people expected Johnny Football to do. And somewhere in that machine, a young man named Johnny Manziel started disappearing inside a character he had helped invent. The first crack came before he had even played a full season under that spotlight. Months after the Heisman, back home for the off-season, Manziel was arrested outside a bar following an altercation, charged with disorderly conduct, failing to produce identification, and possessing a fake driver's license. It was minor as legal trouble goes, the kind of thing thousands of college kids do without a single headline attached. Except this was Johnny Football, and every headline about him now traveled at Heisman speed. Then came his sophomore season, and with it, a scandal that would reveal exactly how far the persona had already drifted from the person. Reports surfaced that Manziel had been paid by a memorabilia broker for signing autographs, a clear violation of NCAA amateurism rules at the time. The university investigated, and in the very next game after the story broke, in front of a stadium watching to see how he would respond, Manziel scored a touchdown and made the money sign with his hand, the exact gesture at the center of the controversy, then picked up a costly penalty for taunting on the same drive. His own head coach could barely hide his frustration afterward, saying he had hoped his quarterback would have learned something by that point. Go back to the photo again for a second. The hand, the gesture, the electric grin. Understand that this is the exact moment the meaning of that gesture starts to shift. It is no longer just a celebration. It is becoming a symbol, a shorthand the public will use for everything people think they already know about this kid. Reckless, entitled, a brand who thinks the rules are optional. Nobody was asking the other question yet, the question that would take years and a devastating fall to even get raised out loud. What if some of what looked like arrogance was actually something else? That question was still years away from being asked, let alone answered. For now, the machine kept running exactly the way it always had, because in 2013, Manziel did something that made all the doubts look foolish. He came back for his second and final college season, and somehow got better. 4,114 passing yards, 37 touchdown passes, a dominant, record-obliterating Cotton Bowl performance to close out his college career, over 500 yards of offense, and 4 more touchdowns in a single game. Across 2 seasons, his total production reached nearly 10,000 yards and 93 touchdowns, numbers that had rewritten what people believed a college quarterback could do with his legs and his arm combined. And then, 21 years old, with the entire sport watching, Johnny Manziel declared for the NFL draft. The draft night itself told its own story before a single snap was ever taken. Manziel had been projected by some as a potential top 10 pick, a generational college talent whose highlight reel alone should have guaranteed him a landing spot among the league's marquee franchises. Instead, team after team passed on him, executives quietly citing concerns about maturity and off-field judgment that had nothing to do with his arm or his legs, and he watched himself slide down the board on national television, while quarterbacks with far smaller college resumes went off the boards ahead of him. The Cleveland Browns finally traded up to grab him at 22, the last pick of the first round, a franchise so starved for a quarterback that they were willing to bet on the talent and look past the warning signs everyone else in the league had apparently already seen. Cleveland handed him a locker room, a playbook, and almost immediately, a bench. The Browns had a journeyman veteran named Brian Hoyer holding down the starting job, a serviceable, unspectacular quarterback who represented exactly the kind of steady professionalism Manziel was supposed to be learning from on the sideline. As a rookie, Manziel barely played, appearing in only a handful of games and making just 2 starts, watching a veteran win the job while he learned, by his own later admission, almost nothing about being a professional. He would say years afterward that he watched close to 0 hours of game film that year, that he treated the most important job opportunity of his life like an afterthought, while the persona he had built in college kept demanding his attention off the field instead. The pattern that had started with an autograph scandal in college now had an NFL-size stage, and it got worse before it got better. There were viral party videos. There was a preseason moment, caught on national television, where Manziel extended his middle finger toward the opposing bench after a bad play, drawing a $12,000 league fine and a public rebuke from his own head coach. By the middle of his rookie season, the Browns had seen enough. Manziel disappeared into a Pennsylvania treatment facility for 10 weeks that off-season, checking into rehab without publicly detailing exactly what he was being treated for. When he came back out, he stood in front of reporters and said something that, looking back now, sounds less like a confident young athlete and more like a man trying to describe watching himself lose control of his own identity from the outside. He said that Johnny Football had taken him over, that he had welcomed the hype instead of pushing it down, and that the fault for all of it was his own, and he announced, almost ceremonially, that the signature gesture that had followed him since college was retired. "The money sign will not be back," he told the room. He meant it as a fresh start. For one all too brief stretch, it looked like it might actually work. Manziel returned in his second season, won the starting job outright, and showed real flashes of the player everyone in college football had raved about. Mobile, dangerous, occasionally brilliant. There was a moment against Tennessee where he lit up the box score, a hint of the ceiling that had made him the Heisman winner in the first place. For a few weeks, Cleveland let itself imagine that the gamble might pay off. Then came the final weekend of that season, and with it, the beginning of the end. Manziel was in the NFL's concussion protocol, ruled out of the season finale, and required to check in with team medical staff over the weekend. Instead, he boarded a commercial flight to Las Vegas. He would later describe it himself, in almost disbelieving detail, sitting down at the blackjack tables, getting recognized by a casino employee, checking his identification against the name flashing on a nearby television screen, panicking, and then buying a wig, a fake mustache, and a pair of glasses at a shop off the strip, so he could keep partying without being seen. He introduced himself to strangers at a nightclub that night as Billy, a fake identity built entirely out of a drugstore wig and a cheap mustache, as if the real name attached to his face had simply become too heavy to carry into a room for one more night. He stayed out until 3 or 4 in the morning. He missed his flight back to Cleveland. He never met with the medical staff who were waiting for him. Understand what that weekend actually was. It was not simply a young athlete blowing off a boring team obligation to have fun. It was a man in the middle of a genuine medical protocol, supposed to be monitored for a brain injury, instead disguising his own face so he could disappear into a city built for disappearing. Looked at one way, it is reckless and juvenile, exactly the read the sports world gave it at the time. Days of talk radio mockery about the wig and the fake mustache. Looked at another way, years later, with information nobody had yet in that moment. It reads like something closer to a man running from himself, as hard as he possibly could. He never played another snap for the Cleveland Browns. Go back to the photo one more time. The Heisman celebration, the electric grin, the hand mid-gesture. 2 years. That is the distance between that photograph and a disguised 22-year-old gambling under a stolen name in Las Vegas, while his own team waited for a phone call that never came. 2 years for the most explosive college talent in a decade to turn into a cautionary tale that had not even hit its worst chapter yet. Because the worst chapter was still coming, and it would not just end his career, it would very nearly end something far more important than that. The last weekend of January 2016, in Dallas, is where this story turns from a career collapsing into something far darker. What happened that night comes almost entirely from one source, a sworn affidavit filed by Manziel's former girlfriend, Colleen Crowley, in support of a protective order. It has never been independently verified beyond that filing, and Manziel has denied it from the beginning. But, because it became the legal record that shaped everything after it, it deserves to be told exactly as it was reported, without softening it and without treating an accusation as a verdict. According to Crowley's account, the two of them, who had recently broken up, met that night at a hotel in Dallas and got into an argument over another woman who had caused problems between them before. Crowley said Manziel forced her into his car, drove while she pleaded to be let out, and struck her hard enough, she said, to rupture her eardrum on one side. She told police she begged a hotel valet for help and was terrified for her life. A Tarrant County judge found her account credible enough to grant a 2-year protective order barring Manziel from contact with her. In April of that year, a Texas grand jury formally indicted Manziel on a misdemeanor charge of assault connected to family violence. He denied hitting her, and he continued denying it throughout the process that followed. What happened next matters enormously, because the popular version of this story often gets it wrong. Johnny Manziel was never convicted of anything in this case. In December, prosecutors and his legal team reached what is called a pre-trial diversion agreement, a legal mechanism that is not an admission of guilt. Under its terms, Manziel agreed to complete a court-approved anger management course, attend a domestic violence victim impact panel, participate in the NFL's substance abuse program, and have no further contact with Crowley. 11 months later, in November of 2017, the Dallas County District Attorney's Office confirmed he had met every single condition. The charge was formally dismissed. No conviction, no guilty plea. A closed case, cleared through compliance rather than through a trial. The Cleveland Browns did not wait for any of that legal process to play out. 2 months after the indictment, in March of 2016, they released him. His agent dropped him. His endorsement deals evaporated within days. The most explosive college talent of his generation was now an NFL free agent that no team in the league wanted to touch. 23 years old, unemployed, legally embattled, and by his own later account, completely unraveling in private. What Manziel says happened next, he has only ever described himself, years afterward, in his own words, for a documentary he chose to participate in voluntarily. There is no independent verification for the details of what follows, only his account of his own darkest period. He has said that after the release from Cleveland, he began using cocaine and the prescription painkiller OxyContin every single day. He has said his weight dropped sharply that year, from around 215 pounds early in the year to somewhere near 175 by the fall. He has described planning, in his own mind, to spend as much money as he possibly could on one final indulgence, a kind of self-destructive send-off, before ending his own life. I wanted to get as bad as humanly possible, he has said, describing the twisted logic he was using at the time to justify what he was about to do. He has said he had bought a gun months earlier for that exact purpose. This is the point in the story where the details have to slow down and stay respectful, rather than graphic. What matters here is not the mechanics of that night. What matters is that a 23-year-old man, once celebrated as the most electrifying college football player in America, reached a point where he believed there was no way forward, and made a decision most people never recover from making. He has said the outcome that night did not go the way he had planned it, and that he does not, to this day, fully understand why. What matters far more than the specifics is what he has said came after it. Not an ending, but the beginning of finally understanding what had actually been happening inside him the entire time. Because it was only now, after the career was gone, after the indictment, after the release, after the darkest night of his life, that doctors gave a name to something that had never had one before: bipolar disorder. Sit with that sequence for a moment, because it is the detail almost nobody outside his closest circle understood in real time. The wild spending, the disguises, the impulsive risk-taking, the crushing depressive stretches that followed each high, the sense, in his own words, that the wiring in his head felt twisted. None of it had a clinical name, while the world was busy writing him off as spoiled and reckless. The diagnosis came after the wreckage, not before it. Football did not die from an illness he already understood and ignored. Football died first. Unemployment and disgrace came next, and only then, staring at the wreckage of both, did anyone finally tell him what had actually been happening to his own mind the entire time he was becoming a national punchline. His father, Paul Manziel, would later appear on camera to describe those years with a kind of exhausted honesty. "It has been a long, long road," he said, and he still was not sure whether to call it a good one or a bad one. But his son was still alive. The fences, he said, could still be mended. The public naming of it came in an interview on Good Morning America, less than a year removed from the darkest night of his life. Sitting across from a national television audience, Manziel said the words out loud for the first time. He had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He was taking medication. He was in therapy. He talked about the specific, ordinary cruelty of the illness, in a way that had nothing to do with football at all. Watching other guys doing what he wanted to be doing, he said, while he sat on a couch feeling like a loser, staring at a ceiling alone in the dark, replaying every mistake, and asking himself where any of it had actually gotten him besides out of the league and disgraced in front of the entire country. It would be simple and satisfying to say the diagnosis fixed everything, that a label and a prescription turned the story around overnight. It did not work that way, and to his credit, Manziel has never claimed that it did. What the diagnosis actually gave him was something closer to a map, a way to finally understand which parts of the last 4 years had been him and which parts had been an illness nobody had caught in time. Football, though, was not quite finished with him yet, even if the NFL clearly was. In 2018, he signed with the Canadian Football League, first in Hamilton, then in Montreal, chasing something that felt like professional legitimacy again. It did not last. The league banned him after 16 games for violating conditions of his contract that had been set specifically around his conduct. In 2019, he caught on briefly with Memphis in the short-lived Alliance of American Football, a league that folded before its first season even finished. By 2021 and 2022, he was playing in something called fan-controlled football, a scrappy, fan-voted arena league, more spectacle than career path, serving at times as a player-coach for a team owned by a comedian. Asked about it directly by the Associated Press, Manziel was almost startlingly clear-eyed about what it actually was. "This is not my redemption tour," he said. He talked instead about golf, about maybe coaching someday, about a heart that simply was not in the game the way it used to be. "My heart's not in it anymore," he admitted. "I don't love football the way I used to." That honesty became the theme of everything that followed. In 2023, he agreed to participate in a Netflix documentary about his own rise and collapse, sitting for hours of interviews that would eventually air as part of the network's Untold series. His mother and his sister sat for their own interviews too, describing from the outside what those years had looked like from where they stood. Ahead of its release, he told People magazine, in plain and almost startlingly settled language, that football was a closed chapter of his life. "I have so much life left to live," he said, "and my football chapter's closed, but let's find out what's going to be next." These days, he said, looked a lot slower. Time with his 2 young nieces, rounds of golf, dinners with friends, a life built around almost nothing that resembled a stadium. There was a marriage in there too, to Bray Tiesi, and eventually a divorce, both handled with far less public wreckage than anything from his 20s, the two of them even appearing together, years later, on a reality show about buying a home, the kind of low-stakes, slightly surreal afterlife that fame sometimes offers people once the tabloids have moved on to someone else's crisis. And then, gradually, a different kind of comeback started to take shape, not on a football field, but in front of a microphone. In 2023, he joined a sports betting network as a college football analyst. In 2024, he launched his own podcast, sitting down week after week with other athletes to talk, in his words, through the lens of the players themselves, about the moments fans remember and the ones they never got to hear. Around that same time, he stood in front of a room of students and people in recovery at a university health conference in Alabama and talked, without flinching, about where his addiction had actually come from and what it had cost him. Alcohol, he said by then, no longer had a place in his life at all. The man who once could not sit still long enough to watch his own game film had become, almost without anyone predicting it, someone other people in crisis were choosing to listen to. He was not done being honest about it either, even when the setting had nothing to do with football at all. In 2025, he agreed to appear on a reality competition built around former Special Forces operatives running celebrities through grueling physical and psychological trials. Struggling through one of the challenges, watched by a staff of instructors who did not care about his Heisman trophy, and described him bluntly as a man falling apart, Manziel broke down and talked, on camera, about the shame and regret that had never fully left him. He admitted he had given up on himself once, that the feeling had been eating him alive, that there had been a stretch of time when he genuinely was not sure he wanted to keep living with it. It was the same wound the documentary had already opened, reopened again, voluntarily, years later, as if he had decided that talking about it once was never going to be enough. By then, a strange and quietly redemptive role had also started to find him. Mentor. Young quarterbacks navigating their own chaotic paths through college football began seeking him out for advice, drawn less to the Heisman on his shelf than to the wreckage he had survived afterward. He spoke publicly in support of players going through the modern chaos of the transfer portal and the recruiting circus, the kind of pressure cooker fame he understood better than almost anyone alive. It was a strange inversion of the story that had made him famous in the first place. The reckless kid who once needed saving from himself had become, for a new generation of players, someone worth calling before things went wrong instead of after. And then, this past May, something happened that nobody could have scripted better if they had tried. On a Saturday night at the UFC Apex Center in Las Vegas, 33-year-old Johnny Manziel stepped into a cage for the first time in his life, an amateur mixed martial arts exhibition against a social media personality, more spectacle than sport, the kind of celebrity crossover fight that exists purely for entertainment. Nobody expected much of a contest. What they got instead was a genuine beatdown. Manziel landed clean body kicks, secured a takedown, and unloaded punches from full mount until the referee had no choice but to step in and stop it, just 2 minutes and 16 seconds into the first round. Afterward, breathing hard, grinning, he told the crowd this was good enough for one time, that he would not be doing it again. And somewhere in the middle of that victory, cameras caught him doing it. The gesture, fingers rubbing together, the money sign, the exact motion he had sworn off a decade earlier standing in front of Cleveland reporters, insisting it would never come back. It came back anyway, and this time, it did not read as arrogance to anyone watching. Now look at that photo from the very beginning one more time. The same hand, the same gesture, a Heisman-winning freshman at the peak of a moment he did not yet understand he could not sustain. Back then, that motion meant a kid who thought the world owed him everything, and for years, the world was more than happy to agree with that reading, because it was so much easier than the alternative. It is easier to call a young man reckless than to wonder whether he is unwell. It is easier to mock the wig and the disguise than to ask what a person might be running from that badly. The world got its story wrong for years, not because the world was cruel, but because nobody had the information yet to get it right. The truth turned out to be both smaller and larger than the persona everyone built around him. Smaller, because so much of it traces back to an illness with a name, a diagnosis that arrived only after the worst of the damage had already been done. And larger, because surviving what came after that diagnosis, the addiction, the arena leagues, the divorce, the slow and unglamorous climb back into a life that actually belonged to him rather than to a nickname, took a kind of endurance no highlight reel ever measured. He did not get his football career back. He never will. He is 33 years old now, hosting a podcast instead of an offense, mentoring quarterbacks instead of competing with them, and by his own account, at peace with a version of his life that looks nothing like the one he once assumed was guaranteed to him. But he told the truth about what actually happened to him, on camera, more than once, in his own words, in front of the whole country that once turned his worst nights into punchlines, and in doing so he gave that same gesture back its original meaning. Not arrogance, not a brand, just a man who is still standing, still talking, still here to make it one more time. Some men lose everything and get the chance to climb back. Others never get that chance at all. Next time, the story of a quarterback whose fall had no comeback waiting at the bottom, because the fall was the end. You will want to sit down for that one.